Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Taco Movie Talks. We are celebrating October the only way we know how. That is horror movies galore. I am
Woo!
happy to be here with Ethan. That is the man on the other side of the mic. Why don't you tell everyone how you're doing? And you love horror movies, and maybe talk a little bit about that as well.
Oh yeah. Every year, this is my third year doing this, but every year I just binge a bunch of horror movies, and it's why October is my favorite month of the year, probably.
Growing up, like I used to like Christmas a little bit more, but like as I get older, I think Halloween is definitely my favorite holiday, bar none.
I do agree. Um, Actually, growing up, I didn't like horror movies at all. Well, then again, I didn't really get into. I didn't get into the world of film until I was like 13, but for a while there, I wasn't into horror movies at all.
So I guess that's a really good kind of conversation point. What did get you into it finally? Was there like a certain movie, or was it just a little bit over time, or how did that happen?
I think it was me watching Aliens. I really wanted to watch Aliens.
Admit to detonating the engines of and thereby destroying an M-class star freighter.
Let's go! Move it out!
We sat down there on company orders to get this thing, which destroyed my crew.
A creature that
And one of my parents said you should probably watch the original first, and I was like, nah, I'll just watch Aliens. And then I finally bit the bullet, and I got a DVD copy of Alien, and to my surprise, I thought it kind of blew me away. And now it's one of my favorite movies ever. But the Alien was probably the cause of that.
That's definitely high up on my list as far as horror movies go. I mean, Alien kind of sets the bar for that type of horror film. So I'm assuming, was James Cameron the catalyst that introduced you to Aliens, and then you liked that so much that you kind of went to Ridley Scott's version, and then you're like, wow, like horror can be pretty awesome.
Because at the time I was a big fan of James Cameron. Because Terminator 2 is still one of my favorite movies ever as well. And so I wanted to visit more of his filmography, and Aliens was one that was very beloved, and I didn't know if I wanted to tackle it because it was too into horror, even though Aliens is not really horror.
Yeah, I haven't seen. I will admit, I haven't seen Aliens yet. I have seen Alien, but I guess good question for you. Like, how does it differ? Is it more action, adventure, or how does it kind of differ in your mind?
Aliens does have more of an action twinge to it. Alien is more like a haunted house movie set in outer space. It's got a slow, suspenseful build-up, and once the iconic scene. I don't know if I want to spoil it, but I mean it's kind of one of the most iconic scenes in movie history. But then after that, that kind of becomes the jumping off point to the haunted house scares and this thing that's lurking around this enclosed environment. Aliens is now everybody is armed and dangerous. Everybody is prepped and ready for this, so it's not really gonna be enclosed spaces with no weapons anymore, and people trying to figure it out. It's more like a. I think James Rolfe pointed it out where Alien is like a haunted house movie, and Aliens is like a war movie.
Yeah, and that definitely does sound awesome in its own way. One thing I want to ask you is, when did you start kind of looking into the deep history of cinema and how did kind of horror play a huge role into like the early classics?
Well, there was a point in time where I was big into Dracula adaptations. Um, and there's obviously been so many Dracula adaptations. Uh, Probably my favorite one is actually Werner Herzog's Nosferatu remake,
Yes.
which is crazy, but I actually really, really like that movie. But I like going through very old movies. I recall at one point I was in like a silent movie phase for a while. Um, it's not. I go through phases of movies that I like to watch. Um, I definitely think that college has helped me with that, like understanding more of the history of it. But I just kind of go through phases, and the silent film phase was definitely something to note because I'd watched like Nosferatu, and I know we're not going to talk about this one, but I definitely want to mention The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Yeah, I was like super close to choosing that as the other one. And it's one that I really want to see as well. And I don't know why I chose the Golem, but for whatever reason I did. But Caligari is very, very famous for what it was able to do with set design and makeup and costume, correct?
Yes, very much. German Express. I think it was the film that pioneered the German Expressionist style of set design and cinematography.
And another thing that I have heard, and I don't know if it is necessarily like the literal first, but people have called it the first horror movie, and I don't know whether it's because like quite literally it was. Maybe Dante's Inferno was, and that might predate it, but I think it introduced a lot of the elements that make up horror movies today, and was
Yes.
the first one to do so. Am I right on that?
Very, absolutely. You're right in the money. There's definitely been there's even been Dracula and Frankenstein adaptations in the 1910s, but Caligari was the first to introduce the elements that make up what most horror movies have today.
Wow. I did not know that even the 1910s introduced Dracula and Frankenstein. So that is going to be definitely an interesting topic when we get into Gollum, because I think I might have had a misinterpretation. But I want to ask you, because of your background and your experience behind the lens, your time kind of watching silent films, and also specifically, German Expressionism. What can you pick up from that, and what like kind of does it point your attention towards while you're trying to make film?
I wouldn't say from a cinematography standpoint, it doesn't really sort of influence me in any way. I feel like if I were doing something like theater, it would be a bit more because to me, silent films are a lot like plays, a lot like theater. Um, but in terms of storytelling, there's obviously some merit to the playfulness of some of those early silent films.
I completely agree with you when you say that there is very much a theatrical element to these silent films, and how physical storytelling is portrayed with the actors.
Yeah.
And I guess, do you think that is because the medium is silent and you have to do so, or was it more or less that they were theater background actors and they were kind of trying to portray it the best way they knew how?
It's definitely a mix of both. Because theater is definitely, it has a lot to do with dialogue as well, but it is also a body performance too. So, and then when it comes to silent films, you obviously have to have a very uh, kinetic body performance. Otherwise, it's not going to come out good.
One thing that I will say, and I don't know if it's so much conducive to the silent era or if German Expressionism is the catalyst to this, but the makeup and kind of character design is one of the strong points that I was kind of struck by in both of these movies. Did you find that as well?
Sorry, what was? I'm sorry, I'm very tired, but can you say that again, please?
Like the way that Nosferatu looked and the way that Golem looked, and even kind of side characters, you could get in essence for if they were bad characters, like maybe even a mad scientist, they used the makeup very well. Do you find that was kind of something the silent era was great at, or that it was more so German expressionism that brought it to the forefront?
That's an interesting question. I think I don't want to get too into it, but I think the makeup for at least Nosferatu is one of the key elements to making that character as creepy as he still is today.
I completely
So
agree on that.
I don't know if it's the silent era or if it is the German Expressionist. Um, I definitely think German Expressionism at least helps with the jaggedness of maybe Nosferatu, but Golem is like a clay figure. Um, that's more along the lines of Jewish folklore. So could be the silent era and them trying to make the makeup as warped as possible.
Yeah, and it's kind of like a strange dynamic that by taking away one of the, I guess, elements that we're familiar with now, it can force to kind of compensate in another area, and it really adds to the film. Like Gollum, I thought had such a unique look, and then obviously Nosferatu, like you said, but it's worth reiterating, has one of the most striking and iconic looks in all of horror history. And I don't know if it would have been as big a focus had there been dialogue to maybe compensate for that.
Yeah.
I could be wrong though, but I do feel like it's the early pioneers for how we create the look and feel of monsters, and for that, I think that's what makes this expressionist era one of the greats as far as cinematic history.
Definitely. Another German film that really revolutionized that is Metropolis.
I wanted to ask you about that because my knowledge of that film is very very slim, and it was said to be a part of the German Expressionism, era or movement.
Yeah.
Kind of what is the plot and how? Because I guess I maybe misinterpreted what it was about just from the poster, but it didn't seem nearly as like dark and grim as the films we seen. But is it actually turn out to be more like that? I guess.
There's definitely so Metropolis is possibly the greatest silent film ever made. It's a huge bombastic epic about a utopian society where there's the workers who literally work below the surface, and then there's the higher ups, the rich people, that control the poor people, and so it's kind of a riff on the social structure, and I think in horror conversations it's brought up a lot because it has pioneered a ton of horror tropes and horror elements that we see today. That Caligari probably didn't, or Nosferatu probably didn't, but there is many different science fiction horror elements in there. Particularly, maybe the most iconic moment from that, which is the first look at the robot.
Okay. Okay. Another one that I will highlight, and though I have not seen it, Ethan, you may have seen it. I think it is called The Man Who Laughs, which is said to be the early inspiration for the Joker in Batman lore. Have you seen that film, and have you heard that comparison?
Not, and I have not heard that comparison either.
So, kind of a look at the makeup is, it looks very much like some of the early versions of like the television Joker. The hair is kind of gelled back. It has this huge kind of manic smile, dark eyes, and also I think he laughs and has like a very kind of manic energy to him overall. So I guess a lot of people think that it is what inspired the Joker. So just another huge footprint in the history of cinema as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's dive into our first movie, which is The Golem, how he came into the world. Overall, like one of the interesting elements to this, and you might know this as well, Ethan, this was the third part of a trilogy and is the only remaining film that survived the test of time. I guess the footage of the previous two no longer exist, and this one was pretty much stitched together to exist today, which is kind of a neat little tidbit.
Yes, I do know about this. The first was 1915, and the second one was 1917. Yeah, I think both of them are at least partially lost, but it was a pretty big portion of them both lost. I think they were able to stitch together at least the first one. Um, Actually, in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the second one is doesn't believe to even exist like to begin with. I'm not sure about that, but I've heard like maybe the second one doesn't even exist. I'm not sure.
So like the entirety of the footage is gone is what you've read.
No, I think I've read that there's at least one film from that era that um like people say it never even existed at all.
Oh, that's actually that's a pretty cool tidbit that I wasn't aware of. But I guess with the nature of how elusive this footage is, it would be quite easy to just kind of, there might have been a thought process that, oh, I think they made there was a one in the middle. But yeah, I had not heard that myself, but honestly, with how mysterious and again elusive it is, it's quite believable. It's pretty crazy to think about too, and it's to me like the lost footage is like such an interesting and kind of crazy thought to think about, that footage could
Yeah.
just be lost over time.
Yeah, there's a couple films like that. Probably the most famous being London After Midnight with Lon Chaney Sr.
and Lon Chaney and his son both are just absolute momentous figures in horror. And
Absolutely.
it's
And most, yeah.
No, I'm sorry, Ethan, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna talk about London After Midnight real quick. Even though like London After Midnight is probably one of Lon Chaney's most iconic characters that he's ever made, and it's still technically a lost film. There's no real footage for it. All you get is like pictures, stills of it.
And I think I have heard about that film, and I'll try to look it up as well. But what did it kind of look close to the Phantom of the Opera, or what kind of was the look of that character?
Is sharp teeth with a top hat and long hair.
Okay. I have seen that because it's kind of used as a further example of, because I think Lon Chaney Sr. and some of those like really great monster actors, they would do their own makeup. Am I correct on that?
Yes, Lon Chaney is famous for being the man of a thousand faces, but also him being able to do his own makeup. So he did his makeup for Phantom of the Opera. He did his makeup for this. Probably did his makeup for a few other things. I don't remember what else he was in.
Yeah, and next week we're going to be jumping into all of these famous actors, including Boris Karloff, Lon Chaney, and Bela Lugosi. But I have always been like a huge fanboy of those actors while having never seen their films, but just because of how striking they looked as their characters. And I have so much respect for those actors, and I wonder if there will ever be a time period like that again where the monster actors become movie stars as well. What are your thoughts on that, Ethan?
I feel like we're actually coming through that right now. Actually, someone like maybe Willem Dafoe, like character actors like that. Because I wanted to say this with a little bit of movie news that Robert Eggers, the director of The Lighthouse, The Witch, The Northman, in my opinion, the best director that came out of the 2010s and is working today. He is jumping back on his Nosferatu remake.
I heard about this news as well, and quite honestly, I am going to be pretty much close to the front of the line to see that film once it comes out, because
Absolutely.
that sounds like such an exciting project, and Nosferatu is such a rich subject matter, and I can't wait to see what he does with it.
Absolutely. But in terms of character acting, it's definitely different. But I feel like there is some level of similarities to it.
I agree with you as well, but I kind of want to get your take on like how the dynamic seems to have changed over time, where today the character actor feels like very much a supporting actor, whereas back in that time period it was kind of the leading man. You know what I'm saying?
That's a good point. Yeah, that is a very good point. They're the star of the show, but nowadays they are the sideline.
And there are a few people in modern, because when you brought up modern, it kind of sparked my mind to think. There's the Terrifier, who's also, there's a movie coming out this month, which is going to be the third of the series. Are you familiar with that? I think when we went over some horror movies, you might have. I'm not familiar if you had said you had seen that clown character.
Not. No, I didn't.
It would be one to check out just because it feels like it's very much. It's going to be one of the characters that I think is going to be one of those franchises that's going to be perpetuated for at least another decade, especially if this next film does well. And I guess another one would be Skarsgård, another clown character, from It.
Yep. He's actually going to be playing Nosferatu in this
No
upcoming remake.
way. Really?
Yeah.
That sounds like perfect casting to me.
Oh yeah, totally.
So this story, the Golem, how he came into the world, like you had said previously, is Jewish folklore, and it is kind of the mad scientist creating something which can be used for good, but can also get out of hand, and feels very, very much in line with the Frankenstein story that we are very, very familiar with today. And
Yes.
you brought up a good point. I did not realize this, and I'm not sure. How did you see the 1910 Frankenstein? Because, quite frankly, I did not know of its existence.
I have not. It was actually made by Thomas Edison, believe it or not.
No way. Is it? Because I know that Edison had short films, and I think one of them is of the electrocution of an elephant. And don't quote me on that, because if I'm wrong, I'm going to sound like a lunatic. But was that also like a very short film, or was it actually close to what we consider feature length now?
I think probably I don't know about that, but I know that at the time uh like by 1910 there still weren't quite narrative features yet.
Okay.
I think around 1917, maybe 1918 is when they started to introduce like hour-long movies.
Okay. So I guess, and this is just something we can pontificate on, but if you have any knowledge to the contrary, I would love to hear it. To me, when I saw this, and obviously without the knowledge of Frankenstein, I felt like it very much set the elements that could help create the character of Frankenstein. Now, obviously, the subject matter existed prior to this, but the way they handled the golem, the big lumbering nature, the imposing kind of physical attributes, set up perfectly what you could build into a Frankenstein monster, and also the creation, but that kind of falls in line with the actual text as well. So, I guess in your opinion, do you think that while this is very much folklore based, do you think that the Frankenstein novel helped inspire this, or do you think the film elements from this went on to help inspire the movie that would come in the 1930s?
I think both. I think this is definitely inspired by the book at least, but obviously the character acting is like a big hulking monster who uh, lurks around, and also like the mad scientist who has accidentally got it out of hand. It definitely inspired uh, the Boris Karloff 1931 Frankenstein.
Yeah, that was kind of my thought process as well. And I think another like pretty neat element to this, right, is that this movie kind of outlines what has been a historical recurring theme, and that is I guess, the prejudice and the trials and tribulations that the Jewish people have gone through, and to kind of that they needed a superhero to protect them, but also it became a threat to their society as well, which is interesting, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think it needs to be stated that while today there doesn't seem to be as much of a threat to like the Jewish culture, this was filmed and released in a time where there was a very imminent threat on the horizon to the Jewish people. So it's very interesting to have this kind of representation, you know, a couple decades before they were almost genocided in history.
Yeah, Yeah. Um. Yeah. I think that's a very interesting point. Um. It. Yeah. I feel like it was a bit too long before, because
Hmm.
this is 1920. Um, World War II started in about 1933, 1934. Um, at least the Holocaust started at around 1933, 1934. And yeah, I mean that's a very interesting point, though.
And I guess it makes me wonder, and I think your counterpoint brings up a good stance as well. It makes me wonder if the directors kind of felt that there was a stereotype and that people might have looked at them a certain way during this time period, or whether that would evolve a lot over the coming years and wasn't quite. I mean, obviously, in 1920, it was not as horrific as it would get, but I wonder if there was kind of some groundswell that made them believe that there was stereotypes during that time period.
Um, Hit. Well, so Hitler at the time, I think it was 2 years after World War One had just ended, and so Hitler, I don't think had come to power yet, but
Mm-hmm.
he was kind of on the rise of power, and he was kind of the guy who put it in everybody's head.
Yeah, I mean, he was the forerunner of kind of bringing a lot of attention to the race theory that they had at the time of the Aryan race, the Jewish race, and so on and so forth. And I feel like, and one thing that I will say, and I don't remember exact dates, but I think there was text that kind of inspired Hitler's ethos into this, and that kind of introduced the racial theory to him and what he was able to kind of cling on to and use to come to prominence. So I don't know if that plays a role into what inspired this and why they felt it was timely, but it could just be kind of an interesting side note nonetheless.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to ask you, Ethan, what were some of the kind of standouts that really stuck with you for this film?
Um, I'd say like something like Golem on top of the building is a
Mm,
moment that stands out in my mind. Him getting really angry um, at his creator, and because he's trying to steal his star, and he gets like his face gets really intense.
mm,
Um, but I also like the scene where the girl at the very end. The girl rips the star off of his plate, and he just falls down, and then a bunch of girls just start going up to it, and just one girl sits on it, and then it's just like they're just there for the rest of the fight, like the last 3 minutes of the movie.
yeah, and so that had like a huge striking element that again I found similarities with Frankenstein in that they are sometimes portrayed as like gentle giants in a way. Did you see that
Yeah,
as well?
sort of. Yeah, even though he was kind of, well, he
Destructive.
was like distracted, and then the girl just ripped it off, so he just fell down. Um, the one aspect of this that really caught my attention was the cinematography, which makes sense because it was the director of photography was actually Carl Freund, who did the cinematography for Bela Lugosi's Dracula, as well as he directed The Mummy.
And the photographer would also, wouldn't he go on to win, and it might have been one of the movies you mentioned, but he would win either an Academy Award or an Oscar for Best Director. Am I right on that?
I'm not sure, but I think he is one of the greatest cinematographers who ever lived, just because a lot of his shots really pioneer um, eerie, intimidating atmospheres.
Yeah, and I would I would totally agree with that. And something else that really there was a lot of aspects to this film that just completely stood out to me. I mean, the character design of the Golem is great. I also thought that the costumes, the makeup, but also the set design, and which is kind of surprising to me, is that the special effects kind of in a way hold up very well in my opinion. Do you agree with that?
Um, they definitely seemed a bit better to me than most films of that time. But I do agree with you. The set design, obviously, the German Expressionism again. That that German Expressionist set design is what really adds to that very warped environment.
Yeah, I was in love with like the scientist's kind of abode, and I loved that spiral staircase that went to the top of the building. Like altogether, all of that just looked tremendous to me.
Yes, absolutely. The spiraling staircase is one pinpoint as well.
And that's something that I think recurs in, early horror history, where that seems to be something where like Dracula has that. I think Frankenstein has that. And I wonder if that is a big inspiration for them, just because it was such a iconic look and set design.
Yeah.
Another element, and I just want to highlight the monster in this film, because it wasn't something that I super expected. I thought the facial expressions of the Golem were really good. I don't know if it quite beats out some of the classic horror actors as far as what he was able to do facially, but he portrayed menace very, very well, I thought, through his facials.
Yeah, so the guy who played the Golem is actually Paul Paul Wegener, who is actually the director of the film, and
Okay.
um, he definitely has a very intimidating face, and being able to use that is a kind of a gift.
I did not know that. I guess, yeah, his name is on the screen as one of the directors, and I think I was surprised because so Carl Bose was another one of the directors, but I looked at Wegener and I was surprised because I think this is the only film that he has directorial credits for. So I guess that makes sense. He wanted to be kind of the flag runner, the face of this film. So it was just a perfect storm for Wegener.
Yeah, but I think the highlight of this movie is Carl Freund.
And is that the kind of the assistant, the one who is in love with the scientist's daughter?
No, Carl Freund. I was talking about the highlight is his cinematography.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. I'm sorry. My
I
mistake.
get. I was like, but the real star is the cinematographer. That's what I was doing.
Yeah, but that is like, first of all, I want to say the restoration of the footage was like tremendous, because there are a lot of films that are even like a decade after this where this footage just looks so much better. But on top of that, the cinematography, like you said, is one of the best examples in early cinematic history.
Absolutely.
This film, to me, is one of those early films that not only was I surprised by how good it was, but it's also one of the highest rated that I've seen this week. And I guess, were you surprised by how much you liked it, or did you have a different experience when you viewed it?
I had the same respect for it as I did Nosferatu. I don't love it, but there are certain aspects that are absolutely fantastic, and it does absolutely hold the place in film history, just in general.
What are some of the negatives that you were able to kind of identify?
It's a little. It's just a little on the basic side, I guess. It's not. It doesn't really interest me in the way that maybe Cabinet of Dr. Caligari does, just because Caligari is just so interesting as far as like a story perspective and as far as like a atmosphere perspective. That is like one of the most warped, very eerie films, in my opinion, is Caligari. And Nosferatu, not really as much. You don't get those elements as much. But what you do get is Max Schreck's intimidating performance. And obviously, the Dracula story is an interesting story. And Golem is based off of Frankenstein, which is an interesting story, but it's kind of derivative, if that makes sense.
I definitely agree with you there. It felt like you said it was more of a mystical feel than like a creepy feel from what you would get from other movies, and the story points don't they don't branch out much further than where the story goes. At some point, like I do like how the love affair kind of ties into the story and then brings it to its conclusion. That was one of the elements that I did like, but at least from the beginning, it was a little bit basic, as you said, and it didn't take away too much from me. But when you say that, it does track, and I do agree with that statement as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, from that standpoint, Ethan, what did you rate this film, and any final thoughts as well?
I think this movie is obviously very important, but overall, it's just pretty good for me. I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10, 3.5 out of 5.
Okay, and I'm pretty close with you as well. I think just like how many elements felt like pretty high quality, and also looking through it in a historical lens, I just gave it a slightly higher score, and I gave it an 8 out of 10. Moving on to Nosferatu by F.W. Murnau. Would you like to do the honors and kind of give the summation of a classic story in Nosferatu?
Yep. So, Nosferatu is Dracula. Boom.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, no, I should just touch upon Dracula, though. So, it's definitely one of the most iconic stories in history about an insurance salesman who ventures to Transylvania to make a deal with Dracula. And he is cursed by Dracula, and Dracula is moving to England, specifically Carfax Abbey, to seek fresh blood for his livelihood. And yeah, that's kind of the basic plot of Dracula. It's Nosferatu is literally it's just Dracula.
Exactly. And as a kid, I guess I didn't really realize that, but as I've heard the Dracula story retold, yeah, I mean, you're dead on the money. I mean, this is literally beat for beat the story of Bram Stoker's Dracula, to the point that I think I watched this on Plex. He actually gets writing credits for this movie.
Yes, most authors do get writing credits.
So,
For this movie in particular, yeah, that makes sense.
yeah. And two of the standout elements, one you mentioned was Max Schreck's portrayal of Nosferatu was visually stunning. He was creepy as hell. The look was absolutely perfect to where I think you see the image of Nosferatu now. It's still hella creepy and pretty much, I would say, even downright scary. And I also liked one of the elements that I liked was how creepy the entire, like, the editing made certain scenes with, like, it almost looked like kind of stop motion and how they tried to make it look quick and how the movement was unnatural. Those two were the standout for me. And what about you?
Yeah, definitely. Some of the editing it really helps it out. Like, I think one big example is I feel like it's like an early rendition of a jump scare, or it could edit to just uh, Nosferatu, Count Orlok is his name. He just standing in a hallway, and it is one of the most creepy images in cinema history. Like every time I look at it, I just chills are sent down my spine.
I agree. And yeah, his look is just, it's unmistakable. It's one of the most iconic looks you could ever see. And on top of that, the shadow scene is like one of the most iconic visuals that I think exist in horror history.
Yes, absolutely.
One thing that you brought up, and I completely agree, not disagree, was that you prefer Herzog's kind of interpretation of this story as the best, and I could not agree more with you. And I love what Herzog was able to do with it because it kind of gives a more solid and more, background and motivation for the character of Nosferatu. And
Yes.
is that kind of what tracked for you or made you gain appreciation for that film as well?
I think the reason why I appreciate it more than most other Dracula adaptations is because of Werner Herzog's very documentary style. He has a very documentary approach to feature film. So for him to give this take on a very classic story makes it all the more interesting and unique as far as filmmaking. In terms of the story, it's Dracula again, but it's it's an interesting form of Dracula.
Like, obviously he takes a lot of story beats, directly where they could match up very well as like shot for shot, a lot of the similarities. But what he added, as far as like the motivation for Nosferatu and also the ending, is what makes his Dracula and vampire interpretation the best, in my opinion.
Yes, certainly. I mean, like, not a lot of people will like that. Either you go Stark with this movie, or 13 years later, you get Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, which is the most bombastic, over the top Dracula experience that you will ever find.
One thing that I kind of want to discuss, and just because it's in the same vein, no pun intended, as this Dracula story, is, I mean, when you compare Coppola's Dracula to Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire, how do you kind of compare and contrast, and how do you give the nod to one? And I guess, did you find Coppola's movie to be very effective, and did you really, really like that movie as well? I guess that's kind of a loaded question.
Uh, Actually, I'm not the biggest fan of Coppola's Dracula. I was excited to watch it, and then I watched it, and I was like, That was kind of disappointing because it was really over the top, and people like that, and I'm just like, there are some points where it just goes too far. And Nosferatu the Vampire is something that I really enjoy, which is very stark, very realistic, very down to earth levels. It's not as obviously it's not as down to earth as something like uh, maybe a Gear of the Wrath of God, which
Hmm.
is like really like a gritty war film.
Hmm.
But Nosferatu is very documentary like as it could get.
Yeah, and I think you probably from what you said have the same feel, is that Coppola's Dracula felt like there was so much meat on the bone and so much potential that just in my opinion was lost when you look at the costume design, when you look at what was done directorially, the visual aspects to it make it seem like this could be an absolute classic that just for many reasons doesn't quite hit the mark for me.
Hmm.
And I don't, because there's so many things that I think, little things that add to that. I don't know where to start. And I think what you said is probably the best way to identify all of the flaws, is just the bombastic nature takes it a little bit too far and it feels overly theatric in certain senses.
Yeah.
For you,
Like,
oh, go ahead.
oh, I was gonna say Gary Oldman has a baboon's butt on his wig. That's how you know. That's
Yeah.
how you know that it's a little over the top.
And yeah, just you identifying that, you bring up like a really, really good point. Whereas, like, this version of Nosferatu is much more scary than Gary Oldman's Dracula. And you would think throughout time you would be able to create something that is much more menacing and terrifying. But that was not quite the case.
Yeah, I thought that one hospital shot from American Werewolf in London was scarier than Gary Oldman.
Yeah.
I mean, no, that shot terrifies me, but I don't want to get off track.
No, but I guess what were some of the elements that you identified from Frederick Wilhelm Moreau's interpretation that really made it effective in your eyes?
Um, Wait, Frank, who? Wait, what?
Or F.W. Murnau, sorry.
Oh, yes, the comparing the remake with the original. I think the original is obviously more body. I think uh I feel like Max Shrek is a lot more eerie and disturbing, but I think Klaus Kinski did a good performance as well.
I'm a huge fan of Klaus Kinski, and I think
Yes.
you know that. What here's the thing that makes it very surprising to me is Kinski is like a very bombastic, over the top actor,
He is.
and Shrek feels very subdued, but the elements that he does use, he uses very effectively.
Yes. Very stark, very cold. But I
Yes.
also prefer that balance that Nosferatu the Vampire has, which is very documentary like scenes with very real performances, it seems, and then Klaus Kinski's performance.
He hits the nail right on the head there, and it's like it's in my top three Klaus Kinski performances for sure. Fitzcarraldo, and then Aguirre being up there as well. But Max Schreck, was he someone who kind of goes off to have a very successful career, to your knowledge, after this performance?
It's the only one I know him from. I don't know if he really had any success after Nosferatu or even before Nosferatu. Yeah, there's not really much I could say about Max Schreck other than Nosferatu, but he's definitely iconic for a reason.
Yeah, and I guess this is kind of one of those situations where you're born for a role, and then once it happens, it's kind of hard to find that level of success after the fact, right? Because I mean,
Possibly.
this is probably one of the more perfect acting roles or portrayals that you can find anywhere.
Yeah, certainly.
So, what were your final thoughts for Nosferatu, and what was your rating as well?
I don't know what else I can say about Nosferatu. It's Nosferatu. It's a classic. People, many people should experience it for themselves. It's not my favorite silent film. I mentioned before that Metropolis is kind of a masterpiece, and Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, I think, is more important to the horror genre as a whole. But as far as horror classics are concerned, this is a must. I give this a 3.5 out of 5 as well.
Yep. So I'm right there with you. I gave it a 3.5. I actually prefer the Golem,
Yeah.
and that shocked the hell out of me. Did you prefer the Golem as well, and were you surprised if you did?
No, I prefer Nosferatu just because of its classic stature.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I will say, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier, is that, I mean, look, Nosferatu as a character design is just miles ahead of the Golem. Despite the Golem being solid for what it was, I thought Nosferatu it's hard to beat.
Yeah.
One last kind of topic that I want to kind of bring up. As far as vampire movies as a whole, we have two polar opposites to the way that vampires are portrayed. We have the handsome vampire. Twilight has made this very, very famous, but it's kind of it's an alluring, attractive vampire that it kind of, in a way, covers up maybe one of the plot holes where it's like people you would think would be running away from a vampire that looks like Nosferatu. And then we have on the other side the Nosferatu, the kind of animalistic monster type portrayal. And I kind of want to talk about that and the strengths of what each side has and your preference.
Well, if there's one movie that has a mixture of both that I am currently watching at the moment, I'm currently watching Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark, which has been on the top of my list for a long time. I for months and months, it's just I wanted to watch it and it's nowhere to be found. Finally, Criterion picked it up, and this month they're hosting, as part of their '80s horror collection, they have Near Dark. So finally, I'm able to watch Near Dark. And there are completely different sides of the coin. There's the very over-the-top, monstrous vampires like Bill Paxton's character, and then there's vampires who are probably more eerie. None of them are eerie in the sense that they just look like normal people, but like there's different like stages to being a vampire, and the way they tackle being a vampire is very interesting. So as far as how they portray their own moral character, I think it's those portray different parts of like something like Dracula or maybe like Twilight.
You brought up a really good point. Near Dark was on my list for a long time, and I was on Criterion but didn't look to what they put in that 80s collection, and I am ecstatic to hear that they put Near Dark because you are not kidding. That movie was damn near impossible to find just a month ago. So
the Blu-ray for it looks like Twilight because the Blu-ray was released in conjunction with Twilight. It wasn't released like it was released to capitalize off the success of Twilight.
okay, and I guess, and I think the Bela Lugosi Dracula was where we kind of started to get away from this very, very creepy and striking visual look. But I think another good example is Interview with the Vampires, where they were like, let's kind of have a character that we can understand how it would mesmerize women and like let them into their homes, and added more to that type of mythology and everything too.
Certainly. I wanted to say that Bela Lugosi certainly is a creepy figure in Dracula.
He and they add so much to. I mean, he does look like a haunting type figure, but there's also like
it's not quite Max Shrek level.
Yeah, exactly.
Is what you're saying.
Yeah. And I guess which one do you kind of appreciate more? Like which version of vampire do you like in your cinema?
I guess I like something. I've learned that Dracula, it doesn't interest me as much as it did. But I'd like something like interesting, like Near Dark, where some like the characters are presented as actual characters, not like John Carpenter's vampires, which is a mediocre pile of crap. Kind of. It's just the vampires are treated as like faceless zombies, I guess. But I just like to. I like a good, a nicely presented, interesting take on vampires, like Near Dark.
I want to highlight two other vampire movies that I kind of forgot about, but just came to mind. And if you've seen them, I kind of just want to get your takes on them as well. Have you seen Lost Boys? And
I have seen Lost Boys.
How do you like how they kind of did that up for that like late 80s, early 90s feel of a vampire?
Well, so it was the same year as Near Dark, actually, 1987,
Okay.
and it was directed by Joel Schumacher, who would go on to direct classics such as Batman and Robin, and and the thing is that Near Dark and Lost Boys tonally are totally different. Near Dark is wallowing in misery, and The Lost Boys is really fun, which is probably why Near Dark didn't do well at all when it came out, and The Lost Boys did very well. But I think the interpretation of vampires isn't as interesting.
No, I see where you're coming from there. And then another one that I want to highlight and see if you have seen it is Fright Night, which also I think is in the 80s.
I have not seen Fright Night, but it is kind of what started. I'm pretty sure it's what started the resurgence of vampire movies in the 80s.
One thing, and I want to highlight it for anyone else who hasn't seen it, is it also introduces this meta element to it that it's awesome, and I really like it because one of the actors I think is a famous actor from doing, shows in which he plays Van Helsing, and he plays the actor in the film, but he's the only one who has knowledge on how to create or how to destroy vampires. So I think I completely bumbled that explanation, but it's one that I would definitely check out if you have any interest, because it's a standout amongst that subgenre.
Certainly.
So, Ethan, next week we have an awesome schedule. We're going to be covering 4 of the top tier Universal horror monsters. And I guess, which one are you most excited for? Or do you just kind of love that whole like horror element as a whole?
So we're doing Dracula, the first 2 Frankensteins, and the Mummy. Is that what we're doing?
Yes.
I want to throw a 5th one in there, if that's okay.
Okay.
One of probably my favorite of all the original Universal monsters, because there's 6 of them. But my favorite first movie is actually The Invisible Man, and I want to touch on that.
Hell yeah. I'm totally down. And they added that to the Criterion collection as well, as they did a double dip, 80 horror movies and the Universal monsters. I saw that on there, and that is definitely one that I want to see. And
Yeah, it's not my favorite all-time Universal monster movie, and it's the other one is also in there, but it's not an original.
so I'm very excited. And would you say that Frankenstein is the monster amongst those that is the standout for you, or is it?
I guess I'll just spoil it. Bride of Frankenstein is my favorite Universal monster movie.
And that's kind of the standout, and a lot of people hold that same sentiment, I believe. So.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I'm really excited for that, and I hope that if you've listened this far, you are very excited for that as well. Ethan, you have been great as always. Much thanks for coming on and talking old school
Pleasure.
horror with me. I very, very appreciate it.
Of course.
Well, that is all for us today, and we will catch you on the flippity flip. Bye, y'all.